Carol Hamrin co-edited a 3-volume series called Salt and Light, Lives of Faith Shaped by Modern China, as well as volumes like God and Caesar in China, 2004, Decision Making in Deng's China in 1995. A former U.S. State Department China specialist, she's a research professor at George Mason University, a senior associate with the Global China Center. Carol has been called the most well-informed Western Christian scholar on China today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Hamrin.
Good morning. Glad to see you here. I'm glad to be here. I'm honored to be here, sharing as we explore together how to combine our work and our faith, our profession and our redemptive calling to serve others. That kind of endeavor is a long-time, lifelong pursuit for all of us. And for me, it began with the ethos at St. Olaf College, my alma mater. So I'm glad to be back in Minnesota, especially on such a beautiful weekend. But it also continued in my life, juggling the demands of work at the State Department with family. I have 3 grown children with my husband, Bob, and also trying to advise ministries involved in China. So someday I'll write a book called The Juggling Act or The Balancing Act, and it's really worth the effort. I'm glad to share that topic with you, and Bob and I really resonate on the importance of this effort. For me, researching and writing this book series about Chinese Christians 100 years ago really fits into this lifelong pursuit to integrate faith with work, with life. And I want to introduce, first of all, my co-editor, Stacy Beeler. Stacy, she's here today, and she inspired me to work on this book series with her own book, Patriots and Traitors. It's a history of the 3 major waves of Chinese students studying in America. So we chose those among them who were Christians to write more extensive stories about their lives. And I hope you'll meet her and greet her at some point. We spent yesterday afternoon signing all the books out on the book table for you. So we have really greatly enjoyed working on this project. So I appreciate the chance to share it with you today. And especially at this conference, this thought-provoking conference that hopefully will be life-changing for many of us. And I thank Bob and the other organizers for their excellent work, and thank you all for coming. Well, this slide is showing the basic outline of my talk, the main themes of our book series, and then the international context and lasting contributions. And so I'm going to include in my talk some stories from Chinese Christians 100 years ago and Chinese Christians today who are picking up where they left off as China's civil society begins to revive and the church begins to be involved in the larger society around them. And then I also want to share this great photo of Guang Fuzhou, whose life story illustrates what Stacy and I have been learning and we want to share today. He's second from the left, his bride on the right, and he had a rags to riches story that's very hard to match. He began life as an indigent farm boy who boarded ship in Hong Kong to go to California at the age of 13 by himself to do farm work in California as a bonded coolie laborer. He gave up a gambling addiction while attending high school, night school in English offered by a local church where he later was baptized. In the 1890s, he became the first Chinese staff worker in the Salvation Army. Working his way through college, he managed to get a PhD in education from Columbia University. And then returning to China after 24 years away, he won top honors in the first post-Confucian civil service examination. And right after that, he married this young woman in the photo, Dr. Laura Lum, a native of San Francisco. Later, while working as the editor of a printing press, Kwong pioneered many humanitarian initiatives, setting up the Chinese branches of the Salvation Army and of the Rotary Club, China's first modern welfare agencies for lepers and for refugees, schools for the blind, schools for the poor. Known as a Puritan Christian in Shanghai, he became a personal model for many who knew him, and many who've read of him since then. Well, in our research on China's early modernizers like Kwong, three main themes emerged that I think are relevant to our understanding of China and the rebirth of its civil society today. First, the role of religion in developing civil society, whether in America or Britain or China, is something often overlooked by scholars and the media. This became very apparent to me while consulting for a training project with Chinese NGO leaders in the early part of this decade. And then while working on this book, I was really surprised to find how many social leaders in the early 20th century China were Christians. And this is an important but forgotten part of Chinese history and of the history of world Christianity. Secondly, it seems that Christian beliefs and values help people adapt to modern life. These include an emphasis on human equality, the importance of the individual and the nuclear family, the use of reason and the value of science. And so those values in Protestantism especially inspire commitment to literacy and education for everybody and humanitarian service to those in need. So Protestants in China in particular played a big role in creating modern urban China through their personal example, their ideas, and their institutions, which shaped the broader culture. One Chinese historian I've read has concluded, and I quote, "While Chinese Christians at the time were less than 1% of the population, their cultural legacies occupy a permanent place in modern China. The social reform projects and institutions of the Christian mission endeavor served as models for the national cultural institutions of the whole 20th century." The third main theme that surfaced for us was the important part of social and cultural relations between China and America. Again, this is often neglected by researchers and the media, who focus on economics and politics and military relations between our countries. But many of the subjects in the book series, like Kwong, studied in the United States and lived and worked in China with American colleagues, mostly in the coastal cities, but also in the countryside. And these personal and professional ties across the Pacific brought valuable resources for China's development and also helped preserve cross-cultural relations between our countries, despite periodic political or military crises. And the same is very true today. The good relations we have among people-to-people institutions and exchanges between China and America really provide a buffer for the crises we have when we disagree about currency evaluation and arms sales to Taiwan and these other issues that come up. Well, those are some of the themes that emerged from our research. So next, let me provide a little bit of background on the international progressive era 100 years ago that linked China to the world in new ways and shaped China's early civil society. As in the past 25 years, 100 years ago, there was a wave of globalization. and more frequent contacts between our countries in all spheres of life. Because new technologies back then were interconnecting the globe in new ways. High tech 100 years ago meant the telegraph and the steamship and the railroads. China back then was forced by European and Japanese imperialist powers to open up its economy and society to these outside forces. And in the late imperial period, China experienced the turmoil of early industrialization and rapid urbanization along the coast. Rural farmers were migrating to the new industrial centers, and the rapid growth of the working class resulted in social dislocation, family instability, and personal immorality. Well, in the West, when similar problems occurred in society with industrialization, this spurred religious revivals, moral and social reform movements that you heard about last night and we'll hear more about later today. British and American reform movements interacted and grew into a broad international trend called progressivism, spurred by the conviction that social progress could be made or was even inevitable through the exercise of human will and technology. And during that time, with these reform movements, personal and civic virtues were spread that helped bring about family and social stability through the renewal of social capital, which I define as those shared values and habits that promote cooperation and build trust. The first truly international social movement was the abolitionist campaign to do with slavery and the slave trade, which you heard about last night. After the American Civil War, when that battle was won, reformers applied their experience to other international movements, the campaigns against the coolie trade and then against the opium trade. And several of the Chinese in our book series played an important role. Pastor Yan Yongjing on the left in the photo studied in the US just before the Civil War. And later he wrote about American racism, criticizing anti-Chinese legislation in America. In 1894, he spent 7 months traveling throughout the United Kingdom to testify against the opium trade before the Royal Commission, and in over 100 public meetings, convinced people that the opium trade was a terrible disaster for China, and he helped turn the tide of public opinion in Britain against the trade. Later, the man on the right, in 1909, Chinese diplomat Tang Guo'an worked with American diplomats to organize the International Anti-Opium Conference in Shanghai. This is 100 years ago last year. The first meeting of the great powers where China was treated as an equal. Tang's speeches there on behalf of the Chinese government, pledging that the Chinese would stop the opium use in China and exhorting the West to stop the international trade. His speeches were reported widely by the media in China, Europe, and America, and had a prominent influence